Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to talk to you about science, which I, until recently, found rather abstract, and that is demography. But I happened to come across a rather interesting article recently, which aroused my interest in this field. It struck me, in fact, in reading this article, which was a forecast for demographic trends over the next 40 years or so, up to 2050, it struck me that there are very few things that will change the shape of our world as much as demography. It is going to make an enormous difference to the way we live and the way the world works over the coming 4 decades or so. I'll give you a few figures, but I promise not too many. The forecasts for world population in 2050 are 9.3 billion people, which is close to a 50% increase on the present numbers. Now, 9.3 billion people is a lot of people, certainly, but at the same time, it is far fewer than demographers were forecasting until a few decades ago, until about 15 or 20 years ago. Then the figures, generally accepted figures, were that the world's population in 2050 would be somewhere around 15 billion. So the rate of population growth worldwide has slowed down very considerably, thankfully. We know that there are some other imponderables which may come into play and which might, of course, affect the final numbers somewhat. One of the most important ones, perhaps the most important one, is the development of family planning, or lack of development, as the case may be, in developing countries. Will developing countries follow the Chinese model, which is to keep population growth under very strict control? And in the case of China, it has worked very well. There are clearly negative sides, but the population growth is under very strict control in China. Will other countries, developing countries, follow the Chinese model, or will they continue to let their populations grow very strongly? That's still up in the air. Another factor is AIDS. It is as yet very difficult to predict how many people will die of AIDS in the developing world, particularly in Africa. So that too, we hope, of course, that a cure will be found, or that at least it will be possible to prevent people dying of this disease. But that is still up in the air for the time being. We are aware, of course, that most of the world's population growth, most of the extra 50% of people who are born, will be born in developing countries and not in developed countries. That is not particularly surprising. What is rather surprising, at least to me, is that the balance of population in the developing countries, and indeed also among developed countries, will change. There will be relative changes in population size, some of them quite major, within both those groups of countries, within the developing group and the developed group. The most striking one, to me at least, was the slow but sure shift in population weight between China and India. China is the world's most populous country. It has somewhere around 1.4 billion people. India is the next most populous one with 1.1 billion people, but India is catching up for the very simple reason that, as I already mentioned, China has very strict population growth controls, and India doesn't. Sometime in the next 2 to 3 decades, India will overtake China as the world's most populous country. And no doubt that will also have some major implications, not just for population, not just for demography, but also for politics, the economy, security, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. Let's remember, too, that it's not just a question of the numbers of people, but also of the age structure of the population. China's population will be smaller than India's, but it will also be older and probably less dynamic, less vibrant than India. So who knows, perhaps India will be the new China. Switching now to the developed countries, there are some major changes to some relative shifts in population. For example, within the European Union, overall, the population will stagnate or perhaps even decline. It will depend somewhat on level of immigration that takes place. But there will be quite significant changes in the relative sizes of European populations. For example, France and Britain will see their populations continue to rise. They should rise by somewhere between 8 and 10% by 2050. Other countries of the big four, so the other two, namely Germany and Italy, will see the opposite trend. Their populations will fall by similar amounts, by something around 10%. So that means that no doubt, not just the population sizes, but also the relative importance economically, politically, and otherwise of the major European countries will change. Most parts of Europe will continue, though, to see strong population decline. And the further south and the further east you go, the higher the decline tends to be. Bulgaria, which is both to the south and to the east, for some peculiar reason, will have the highest population decline. Its population will fall by close on 40%, which is an enormous fall by 2050. Japan's population also continues to decline, and there are presently about 127 million Japanese, but in 2050 it is reckoned that there will only be about 100 million, and many of them will be quite old. The United States has managed to buck the trend. Once again, as in many other respects, America sees itself as an exceptional country, and in demographic terms, that is certainly true. The United States, is the only developed country whose population will continue to grow very strongly. And in 2050, there will be something like 450 million Americans, which is a 50% increase on today's figures. So in that respect, the United States represents a trend typical of middle-income countries and not highly developed countries such as in the European Union. Thank you for your attention.